The world of the 12th century was a brutal schism of iron and faith. In Europe, feudal kings, predators circling one another over scraps of land, bowed to a single, greater power, the papacy in Rome, a spiritual hegemon whose true dominion was the minds of men. To the east lay the Holy Land, a sun-scorched battleground, the epicenter of a civilizational cataclysm between the Christian West and the Islamic world. The map was not drawn in ink, but carved by the sword. This was an age of titans, where dynasties were forged in conquest and salvation was a commodity paid for in blood and gold. Into this grand, violent theater of empires, a seemingly insignificant event occurred around the year 1119. On the dusty roads leading to Jerusalem, where pilgrims were routinely robbed and slaughtered, a small band of 9 French knights pledged themselves to a new, radical purpose. Led by a man named Hugues de Payens, they made a vow not of conquest, but of protection. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. They took oaths of poverty, chastity, and obedience, their emblem 2 knights sharing a single horse to signify their destitution. They were a footnote, a flicker of piety in a world consumed by the fires of ambition. This was the spark. The conflict of the age was not merely one of armies. It was a logistical nightmare. A nobleman from England or France wishing to make the pilgrimage or join the crusade faced a perilous journey of thousands of miles. He had to carry his wealth with him, a moving treasury of gold and silver that made him a target for every brigand and pirate from the forests of Germania to the isles of the Mediterranean. To travel was to risk everything. The very act of devotion was an invitation to financial ruin. The poor fellow soldiers offered a solution born of simple genius. It began in 1150, a quiet innovation that would irrevocably alter the flow of power. A pilgrim could deposit his gold at the Templar preceptory in London or Paris. In return, he received not a heavy chest of coins, but a simple letter of credit, a slip of parchment encoded with a cipher known only to the order. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, he could present this letter to the Templars there and withdraw his funds. It was the world's first international banking system, a medieval form of traveler's check born from the twin necessities of faith and security. This was the simple catalyst. What began as a vow of poverty became the engine of unimaginable wealth. The order, exempt from all local laws and taxes by papal bull and subject only to the Pope himself, became the most trusted financial institution in Christendom. Kings and nobles, even the papacy, entrusted their fortunes to the Templars. They were no longer just protectors of pilgrims, they were the guardians of Europe's treasury. They managed estates, collected taxes, and issued loans that financed wars. The simple spark of piety had ignited a financial revolution. The map of Europe remained a tapestry of warring kingdoms, but beneath it now ran invisible lines of credit and debt, a web of financial power controlled by warrior monks who answered to no king. The conflict of interest was now absolute. The Templars served God, but their power was rooted in gold. And in the world of men, the gravity of gold is always stronger. A challenge was inevitable. The growth of the order was a financial metastasis. From a handful of knights, they swelled to an army of thousands, with as many as 20,000 members at their peak, though only a fraction were frontline warriors. The vast majority, perhaps 90%, were non-combatants, administrators, clerks, and logistical masters who managed a sprawling economic empire. Their network of nearly 1,000 commanderies and fortifications stretched from the misty shores of Scotland to the desert frontiers of the Levant. They were, arguably, the world's first multinational corporation, an entity that transcended borders and allegiances, a state within every state. Their wealth became a self-perpetuating force. Donations poured in from nobles seeking salvation, vast tracts of land, castles, farms, vineyards, and entire fleets of ships. They owned the entire island of Cyprus at one point. Yet their true was not in land, but in liquidity. While kings struggled to raise funds for their campaigns, the Templars could move massive sums of money across the continent with the stroke of a pen. This made them indispensable. King Philip IV of France, a monarch with an insatiable appetite for war and a realm perpetually on the brink of bankruptcy, became one of their largest clients. The Paris Temple was not just their headquarters, it was effectively the royal treasury of France. This unparalleled success bred a dangerous hubris. The Templars, clad in their iconic white mantles emblazoned with a red cross, saw themselves as untouchable. They were God's soldiers, but more importantly, they were God's bankers. They answered only to the Pope, a privilege that placed them above the laws of kings. This exemption was a source of constant friction. Monarchs, obsessed with centralizing their own power, looked upon the order with a mixture of dependence and deep resentment. The Templars were a sovereign power operating within their own borders, a military and financial force they could not control. The key figures of this era were not just warriors, but shrewd, calculating men. The Grand Masters, like Jacques de Molay, were not merely commanders but the CEOs of a massive enterprise, presiding over an empire of faith and finance. De Molay, a veteran of the fading Crusades, was a man of immense pride, a guardian of the order's legacy and privileges. He saw the Templars as the bedrock of Christendom. Across the chessboard sat Philip IV of France, known as the Fair for his handsome features, not his temperament. He was a king of cold, ruthless ambition, a man who saw the nascent French state as an absolute entity. His constant wars with England and Flanders had plunged his kingdom into crippling debt, much of it owed to the very order whose Paris temple he had once used as a refuge from rioting citizens. To Philip, the Templars were not holy warriors, they were an obstacle. They were a creditor to whom he owed an unpayable sum, and a transnational power that challenged his vision of absolute monarchy. The nationalistic fervor he was stoking in France had no place for a private army with allegiance to a distant pope. The situation reached its boiling point as the 13th century bled into the 14th. The fall of Acre in 1291, the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, robbed the Templars of their primary military purpose. Now, they were a military order with no war to fight, sitting on a mountain of gold in the heart of Europe. Whispers and rumors began to circulate, poisonously seeded by Philip's agents. Accusations of heresy, of secret rites, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping an idol named Baphomet. It was a campaign of character assassination, designed to strip the order of its sacred aura and expose it as a corrupt and dangerous entity. The world was on the edge of a precipice. The clocks were ticking toward an inevitable collision. The moment of truth arrived not on a battlefield, but in the cold, calculating mind of a king. Philip IV, cornered by his debts and driven by a vision of absolute power, made a decision of breathtaking audacity. The Templars, his primary creditors and a symbol of a power that superseded his own, had to be annihilated. He could not simply default on his loans or banish them, their roots were too deep, their connection to the papacy too strong. He needed to destroy them completely, in body and in name. It required an act of unprecedented political violence, cloaked in the language of piety. The unexpected factor, the move that changed the entire board, was Philip's masterful use of stealth and coordination. He unleashed his ministers, men like the cunning lawyer Guillaume de Nogaret, who had previously orchestrated the kidnapping of a pope. For months, secret orders were dispatched to every royal seneschal and bailiff across the Kingdom of France. The instructions were precise, sealed, and not to be opened until a specific, predetermined moment. The Templars, secure in their fortresses and their centuries of papal protection, saw nothing coming. Their hubris was a blindfold. Then, at dawn on Friday, October 13, 1307, the trap was sprung. In a single, coordinated strike across all of France, Philip's men stormed every Templar property. Knights were dragged from their beds, administrators from their books. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master himself, was arrested in Paris. The efficiency was terrifying. An organization that had stood for nearly 2 centuries, a military and financial titan, was decapitated in a matter of hours. This was the abyss. The order, for all its power, found itself caught in the jaws of its own success. Their centralized structure, once a source of strength, now made them fatally vulnerable. With their leadership captured in one fell swoop, the rest of the organization was paralyzed. Their wealth, stored in stone vaults, was now under royal seal. Their reputation, their most valuable asset, was about to be systematically dismantled. Philip needed the Church to sanction his actions, and he had an ace up his sleeve, Pope Clement V, a Frenchman who owed his election to Philip and had moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, effectively placing it in the shadow of the French crown. Though initially outraged by Philip's unilateral move, Clement was a weak and pliable man. Under immense pressure and the threat of military action, the Pope buckled. In November 1307, he issued the papal bull Pastoralis Preeminentia, ordering all Christian monarchs across Europe to arrest the Templars and seize their assets. Philip's coup was now legitimized as an act of faith. The Templars were trapped. Thrown into royal dungeons, they were handed over to the Inquisition. Systematic, brutal torture began. Confessions were extracted through unimaginable pain, men admitted to heresy, to spitting on the cross, to sodomy, to worshipping a demonic head. These confessions, wrung from broken bodies, were then broadcast as undeniable proof of the order's corruption. The heroes of the Crusades were publicly transformed into monsters. Their ambition had led them to a height of power no king could tolerate, and now they were falling into a darkness of Philip's making. The endgame was a slow, agonizing spectacle of destruction. For 7 years, the trials dragged on, a masterpiece of political theater orchestrated by Philip the Fair. Templars who dared to recant their forced confessions were declared lapsed heretics and summarily burned at the stake. In May 1310, 54 knights were burned together in a field outside Paris, their screams a stark warning to any others who might consider defiance. The Pope, Clement V, tried to assert control over the proceedings, but he was outmaneuvered at every turn by the relentless king. Finally, at the Council of Vienne in 1312, under immense pressure from Philip, Clement officially dissolved the Order of the Knights Templar with the papal bull Vox in Excelso. He did not declare them guilty of heresy, a quiet admission that the charges were baseless, but disbanded them in the name of public scandal and the good of the Church. The victor was Philip. He had erased his monumental debts and eliminated a powerful rival that stood in the way of his absolute monarchy. The Templars' vast assets were officially ordered to be transferred to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller, but a huge portion found its way into the royal coffers of France and other secular rulers. It was a triumph of realpolitik, a cold, calculated act of state-sponsored annihilation. Philip did not blink first, he ensured his opponents' eyes were burned out of their sockets. The final act of the tragedy took place on March 18, 1314. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, now a frail old man after 7 years of imprisonment, was brought to a scaffold on an island in the Seine River in Paris. Along with another senior Templar, he was to be sentenced to life in prison. But in a final, stunning act of defiance, de Molay found his voice. He retracted his confession, proclaiming his innocence and the innocence of the order. For Philip, this was an intolerable challenge. Declared a relapsed heretic, de Molay was to be burned that very evening. As the flames licked at the pyre, legend claims de Molay uttered a final, terrible curse. He summoned King Philip and Pope Clement to appear before the judgment of God within a year and a day. Whether the curse was real or a later invention, the reckoning was swift and uncanny. Pope Clement V died of a painful illness just 1 month later. Philip the Fair, the Iron King, suffered a stroke while hunting and died before the year was out. Within 14 years, the 3 sons of Philip had all reigned and died without producing a male heir, extinguishing the 300-year-old house of Capet. The world had been irrevocably changed. The destruction of the Templars was a cataclysmic event that signaled the end of an era. It marked the brutal triumph of the centralized, secular nation-state over transnational religious authority. Never again would a religious order be allowed to accumulate such power that it could rival a king. The age of faith-based empires was giving way to an age of royal hegemony. The spark of piety that began on a dusty road to Jerusalem, the simple idea to protect pilgrims, had grown into a financial empire that threatened the very structure of power. Its destruction was not a matter of heresy, but of necessity. The old world of knights and popes had to burn to make way for the new world of kings and nations. The story began with a vow of poverty and ended in a mountain of seized gold. It was a perfect, brutal circle, a timeless lesson in the inevitable dance of power, ambition, and fear. The bankers of God were erased, but the system they invented, the invisible, borderless flow of capital, would go on to conquer the world.